Welcome to JustWannaQuilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Elizabeth Townsend-Guard, your host. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School. I also hold two fellowships right now, one at the Business School and one at the Newcomb Institute at Tulane, and I just want to quilt. So today we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Mark Wilson, who is a molecular toxicologist and an environmental hygienist at Tulane University. He's a professor there. And he talks to us about his perspective of everything that's going on. We are also joined with John Sparts, our medical student and public health student, who is awesome. So here's the conversation.
My name is Mark Wilson, and I am at home in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Awesome. We're going to ask you another question we ask everybody that is a little bit off topic for our conversation, which is, do you have any memory of anyone sewing or quilting in your life?
Oh, yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. And my wife.
Your wife sews and quilts?
She's been doing a whole bunch of needlepoint lately.
Nice. Needlepoint is awesome. I like needlepoint. Yes. Awesome. Okay. Well, you get us. You understand our crowd. So we also want to understand sort of what was your life like? Like, what were you doing professionally before, say, January, February? Sort of what was your life like before COVID-19 hit New Orleans? What did you do? Who are you? All that.
So I'm a molecular and genetic toxicologist. I'm a laboratory scientist as well as an industrial hygienist. And the big difference in my life was that I used to spend a whole lot of time in my lab and a whole lot of time teaching on-site classes in the School of Public Health at Tulane. And the on-site classes just went poof. And we all jumped into this digital world.
Right.
And my laboratory productivity has taken a hit because of just the logistics of, dealing with the responsibilities of having a 7-year-old and things like that.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
So what were you doing in your lab? And can you explain to the listeners what an industrial hygienist is?
So an industrial hygienist is focused on the anticipation, the recognition, evaluation, and control of hazards in the workplace. And those hazards include all kinds of various agents, like chemical agents, like industrial chemicals, things like noise, which is a physical agent, ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, which are also physical agents, cold stress, heat stress, as well as biohazards. So basically, it's dealing with anything that can impact human health in an occupational setting, how to identify what's likely to be there and to put in place control strategies so that it doesn't impact people's health.
All right, so my question is, how did you get to that field? I'm curious, what drew you to being that?
That's a fair question. So when I was an undergraduate, I was at the University of Georgia, and I was a psychology and music major. But I had a job with the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences, in which I had a bunch of goats. And what I did with the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences was to see how those goats performed based on what they were eating. And some of what they ate was a grass that had a fungus in it that if they ate too much of it, it was really bad for them. But if we didn't get over that threshold, then they performed really, really well on it. So that kind of got me interested in toxicology and exposure science. So I segued out of psychology and music and got into toxicology. And started studying that at the graduate level, and I've just been kind of doing that ever since.
I get it. Our paths
Yeah.
are interesting. It's all about the goats. That's how you got here. It's so interesting. You're like, it's all about the goats. Okay, one last question before I turn it over to John, which is, how is your life, like what role do you play, and sort of what happened to your sort of what you do once this virus hit? Like, where did that intersect with your professional life?
So basically, I do a lot of exposure assessment type work. So this is really a hygiene issue. And it's not necessarily in an occupational setting, but it's in an environmental setting. So, biosafety and just general hygiene, as well as respiratory protection and personal protective equipment, is just stock and trade of what I do normally.
Very interesting. And how has that changed, or how has that shifted? And then I'll shift it to John. Sort of tell me more about your life now, or the last 3 months, sort of.
I think one of the things that I notice as somebody who has been working in this field for quite some time is that a lot more people are interested in it right now.
Yes.
But there's also a lot of people who have decided that they're experts, whether they have any expertise or not, which can lead to some confusion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I think that we feel that as people who were asked to make masks by friends and hospitals and other people, it was very overwhelming because there was so much coming at us, and people, like, we just didn't know how to evaluate what we were doing and whether we were helping or hurting or any of those things. So I'm going to turn it over to John, because I know he's got specific questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So actually, Dr. Wilson, the first time I met you was actually in a class, and what we were doing was fit testing for N95 masks. So, and I kind of want to get into that just a little bit, because I know that was your purview beforehand, and it's very important now, and it's probably the single most important thing, arguably, for homemade masks today. But yeah, so that was the first time I met you, and I think that kind of leads me to my first question, which is, how are masks involved in your career before COVID?
So, industrial hygiene operates in terms of what we call the hierarchy of controls. And that involves doing things like for an airborne agent that we want to make sure that we're not exposed to. That involves things like, first and foremost, having ventilation so that we remove that agent from the environment. Secondly, it involves things like administrative controls, which are very, very similar to social distancing. Right? You're giving people a set of rules on how they can interact with one another and within their environments. And we prefer those in terms of effectively controlling exposures. And the very last line of defense that we have is personal protective equipment. And the reason that, from an industrial hygiene point of view, personal protective equipment is at the bottom of the control strategies is because people have to use it correctly. It has to be appropriate for the agent that you're trying to control. And it doesn't remove the hazard from the environment. So if that barrier between you and the environmental hazard fails, you're exposed no matter what. So we rely very heavily on personal protective equipment in occupational settings because there's lots of times where you can't engineer the problem away. And honestly, COVID is a good example of, it's not occupational. Well, it is for healthcare workers, but it's not occupational for the rest of us. But engineering controls will be very, very difficult, right? We can't all live in biosafety level 3 bubbles that are under positive pressure, keeping everything away from us all the time. And we can't just bathe ourselves in UV light. So, that's what you do, is you fall back on the barrier that may or may not work. So, and, masks are used in industrial situations for all kinds of things, for things like mold exposures, in people doing construction and demolition, asbestos, organic vapors, as well as just general particulate. So there are lots of different flavors of respiratory protection in terms of masks.
How do we understand sort of what we need? So how do we understand sort of the hierarchy of need? Obviously, those in the medical field treating COVID patients are one category. And then we have many different ones. Say that your person at your grocery shop who's ringing up people all day long versus a regular person versus a teacher in a classroom. Like, I think as we start to think about it, we both know Tulane is now in its process of trying to open it back up and get us back in the building. And I think people are starting now to be worried about, like, sending your 7-year-old back to school and us being with students. And sort of how do we think about sort of how to be protective in this new environment that we're about to face?
So like you brought up grocery store clerks.
Yeah.
So generally, if you go to the grocery store now, they've instituted engineering controls that are plexiglass shields in between you and the cashier, right? That's an excellent barrier. So that's a good example of using engineering controls to deal with the issue. My kid.
Can we pause on that one? Because that's really interesting. Because I know that the schools are really, like, Tulane is all about the plexiglass right now. They're like, well, we're going to plexiglass the crap out of the school. And tell me a little bit more about that barrier and why you thought it's a good thing. Like between the desks at the podium, they've got this sort of idea that they're going to put plexiglass everywhere.
Sure. So the thought about how the primary transmission of the virus occurs is that it comes out of somebody in exhaled breath condensate or in exhaled aerosols, and then it gets inhaled by somebody else or lands on their mucous membranes and infects them. So if you can put something in between to let those particles smack into it and then clean it, then you've effectively broken the possibility of having transmission. The problem with that is a lot of the particles that we exhale don't travel in straight lines, and they act a lot like gases, so they just kind of go everywhere. But it's a good way to break a route of transmission associated with large particles that would be traveling under their own momentum, like a sneeze, for instance.
Right. Okay. So back to your kid. So your kid goes back to school. Thoughts about that?
Well, what I was going to bring up is he's starting back into Little League. He just had his tryouts on Saturday. But they're putting in place administrative control strategies. They're not going to allow parents to sit on the bleachers together, and the kids can't sit in the dugouts. So they're going to enforce social distancing, and here he is right here.
Cool.
Hi,
hey.
They're going to enforce
baseball. It's awesome. Are you excited? Yeah? Oh, I love it. He is awesome. Totally. We like kids. Yes. So he gets to go back to he gets to go back to baseball, but they have to put in these precautions. And you feel comfortable as a parent with that? Yeah.
I feel comfortable both as a parent and a public health professional.
Interesting. Totally.
Good ventilation there, I'd assume, as well. That kind of first tier.
Interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
So
go
you're mentioning this kind of aerosolization, right? And do you mind kind of describing that? Because the word gets thrown around a lot, and I know there's kind of conceptions like that linear particle traveling versus the gas kind of taking, just allowing the particle to float over pressure versus a droplet, et cetera. Do you mind kind of breaking down the two of those a little bit so we can get a better understanding of how they interact with masks and plexiglass and the other things that are built around us to protect us?
Sure. So if you have a reasonably large aerosol particle, it might be something approaching 10 microns or so in size, which is really still pretty small. You couldn't see it with your naked eyes, but if there were a bunch of them in the air, you might perceive it as a haze, right? And those particles travel when you make them move, they travel under their own momentum with inertia, right? They just are governed by the laws of physics. They don't travel terribly fast because they're really, really small, but they tend to go in the direction that they've been pushed in, right? Mm-hmm. So when you sneeze, large particles come out of your mouth and they're directional. They're going straight at whatever it is you were looking at when you sneezed. Now, smaller particles that are also part of the aerosol cloud that you exhale don't really behave by those rules. Once particles get below about 0.2 microns or about 200 nanometers, they act like gases. They don't follow the rules of physics. For inertia anyway. And they just kind of go where they want. They diffuse throughout the environment. So they'll follow concentration gradients. They'll go from areas of high concentration to low concentrations to try to reach an equilibrium. Whereas inertial particles are going to go in a direction that they're going until they run into something, or until gravity causes them to settle out.
So tell me how that relates to the homemade mask phenomenon, and sort of what were your thoughts about it when it was happening, and then as we go into the school year, I mean, now there's all these. So we had the problem of we had to make masks, we didn't know what to do. Now everybody's selling masks, and we don't know how to evaluate them. So, like, what is a good mask, and what does a mask do for us? Like, is there any way for us to keep those teeny tiny particles out, or not? Like, I'm not sure where we're at the mask situation.
So yeah, and realistically, the only way to do that is with a fit test. And what that involves is putting for like a particle mask, what you would do is put effectively a clear plastic bag over your head and puff saccharin as an aerosol at you while you're wearing the mask, and then say, did that taste sweet? Because that's how you evaluate N95 filtering face piece respirators. I don't think that it would work for homemade masks. But I certainly think that a homemade mask is better than nothing in terms of keeping particles out and keeping you from exhaling particles out. But whether or not it's true personal protective equipment, no, I don't think so.
Yeah,
but I also think that it's a good indication that if you are willing to put that mask on your face, you're probably also paying attention to other hygiene practices,
I like that.
Like hand washing and things like that. And it does tend to calm people down. If you see people wandering around in the grocery store without masks on,
it's freaking out.
People get upset.
Yes.
So it is kind of a acknowledgement that we're all in this, and I'm doing my part.
Yeah.
But whether or not it's an effective control strategy,
All right. So I know John has more questions. Let me ask you just a couple, John, if you're cool with that, asking a couple follow-up questions with that. Did you follow? There was a bunch of different kinds of patterns out there, and there was a lot of brouhaha over what fabric to use, all those things. Did you follow that, and did you get any opinion about that? It was very stressful as a sewist, willing to donate my labor and my fabric to not know whether I was helping in any way.
No, I didn't really.
Yeah, you didn't. Okay, cool. And then, so we'll skip that question.
A graduate student who is really interested in seeing if she can use.
We'd love to chat with her. That would be great.
I'll put her in touch.
Okay, that would be great. I would love that. Okay, so
plants.
John, do you want to ask a question? I have a couple questions after that, but go for it.
Yeah, so we kind of touched on, that it is a good public health intervention, but as you said, it's kind of, you aren't getting that fit in there. Do you think, like, even if we had, so I kind of want to talk about, there's a few reasons why initially they didn't recommend masks, right? And then the CDC came out and said, please start wearing face coverings. But I want to talk a little bit about N95s, your work with them, specifically fit testing, et cetera, and the difference between that and a homemade mask. Because I think that's a huge disparity that people find, and surgical masks as well, is you see all of these different shapes, colors, patterns, et cetera. And are they all the same? Why aren't they the same? Why are some people wearing N95s when others aren't, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people that are wearing N95s either had them or got them. But, I also see a lot of people wearing N95 respirators completely incorrectly. Like, N95s fit me horribly because I have a goatee. The only way to really get it to fit correctly is to be clean shaven. So, I would be very surprised if anybody has done any increased fit testing associated with this. I know a lot of my first responder friends have not. They're just, oh yeah, really? I got the mask.
Yeah, it's protecting something. Yeah.
Right.
So quick follow up with that. When you say fit, and you're mentioning facial hair kind of thing. So essentially, the mask, to my understanding, is the point is to create a seal around it to disallow anything in, and then that allows the fabric to do the work. Right. Because the fabric is built in such a way where it's not going to let those particles through. And so that fit is really the key, because if I have this amazing fabric homemade mask, but it's kind of floppy out near the cheeks and it's hooked up here, and the nose piece is out and whatever else, it's essentially like having these doors open to that mask. Like, everything's just wide open.
Yeah, but that's not terribly different from a standard surgical mask.
Okay.
And the idea with the surgical masks is that when you are a surgeon and have somebody cut open on your operating table, you don't want to sneeze in them or spit in them, so it's keeping your stuff out, as opposed to keeping the outside from getting into you.
What about the shields that we've seen? Like people will be wearing a mask and then they have a plastic shield over it that is acting like the plexiglass, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would help with inertial particles. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a sneeze guard on a buffet.
Right. Interesting. How are you keeping your family safe? When this happened, what were your thoughts? I imagine you had your family, but also your larger family as friends. They probably turned to you and asked your advice. What did you say to them?
So my parents are older.
Yeah.
And my dad has a few of the risk factors. So I was very adamant that he not go to the grocery store and things like that when this was early on. I have a couple of other friends who have depressed immune systems because they have cancer. And I've had some pretty intense conversations with them about how they need to alter their lives at this given point in time, and that this isn't something that, you should just figure you can tough it through. Because realistically, we don't have good information about how infective this stuff really is.
Right.
We're assuming the worst, but we're assuming the worst with good reason.
And semi-blind in some way. So assuming the worst without a lot of information. Yeah, I'm curious, and again, if it's out of your field, how do we understand now? So as we open back up and the death rate hasn't been, we're now at very low, a very small death rate here in the city. There are a lot of us that are still not leaving our house. We just what are we supposed to understand now as things open, and what do we do?
Yeah, I think that experiment's just in progress.
Yeah.
I don't think there's an answer to that.
It's not an answer. No.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what happens is going to happen.
So You know,
a lot of it can be dictated by choices, but
a lot of it can be dictated. What? Say that again.
By how we choose to do things. You know, if we choose to go and, be in a bar full of people versus not, I think that's really going to be one of the determining factors. But just like normal life for people, like going to church, that's a really big risk, but it's also an integral part of our society.
Right.
So, I just don't know how we're going to deal with that. I think masks will help, but they're certainly not a panacea for, we're safe,
So I started thinking when you said initially that, your realm as an industrial hygienist is kind of bled out into the real world, where we have, instead of this workplace that we're trying to design all of these things, we now have a world with, SARS-CoV-2 floating around theoretically, right, everywhere, that we're trying to protect ourselves again. So do you see the industrial hygienist becoming like the new consultant? Like a business calls it up and like, hey, get in here and start engineering. Like, let's make this a safe place, or no?
That's the majority of what we do anyway. I think now it's just, so typically it was associated with chemical safety, and now there's a lot of interest in biosafety. So it's just a different agent. But I mean, the core practice of industrial hygiene is exposure, evaluation, and mitigation. And, the things that you do to deal with chemical agents are very similar to the things you do with biological agents. So, but yeah, there's a lot more interest from a lot more arenas. Like, you would get calls to evaluate a work site that was, say, processing some chemical. And that was a normal kind of industrial hygiene thing. But now you might get a call from a poke restaurant that wants to know if they can serve sushi. You know what I mean? Yeah. Just because a lot more people are a lot more concerned about what is it that I may be exposed to specifically when I'm at work.
Really interesting. All right, so I have John, if you're cool, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that I know our listeners are going to ask. One, we have heard that you shouldn't go indoors without a mask because the air conditioning system is going to move everything around, or be in a meeting with lots of people. How do you feel about being indoors? How do you feel about being indoors outside of your house at this point? Hold on, I think we lost you.
I tend to be, and I just really haven't seen a lot of compelling data that shows that COVID is being transmitted through ventilation and things like that.
You cut out a little bit, so I'm just gonna. I'm gonna ask the question again. Sort of, how do you feel about being indoors? Because it cut out right when you said something super important, which is about the right with Zoom. It's the very most important thing, and then it's gone. So tell us again what you think about being indoors in an air conditioning space.
I don't think that I would particularly want to be in a emergency room or a sick ward with a whole bunch of people who are COVID positive.
Yeah.
But just generally, grocery store, office building, especially since they're operating at lower occupancies.
Yeah.
I'm not terribly concerned about it.
We have
me.
Sorry, maybe what?
Just me personally.
That's you personally. Well, I feel like you know a lot. So you're a good guide for us. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to most of us who are just it's magic, right? Why does the sun come out? We have no idea. It's in magic. The other question I have is, we have a lot of law students who have graduated who are now going to sit for the bar, which means they're going to be in a room for 8 hours with each other. And I'm worried about them. So thoughts about that in terms of a prolonged period of time in the same room with others that will probably be asymptomatic, but that doesn't seem to matter. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about how they protect themselves sitting and taking the most stressful test of their life for 8 hours.
And it's a room full of lawyers.
Well, wannabe lawyers. They're not lawyers yet, right?
So yeah, that's a good question. And I think you touched on that a little bit when you were talking about like people being concerned about going back to work.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has gotten a whole lot of attention is the idea of antibody testing.
Right.
And another thing is identifying asymptomatic people who may or may not show up with antibodies.
Right.
So especially given the clientele who are going to be sitting for the bar.
Yes.
Proclivities for suing.
Well, Mississippi, I have to tell you, Mississippi's making them sign a waiver that says if you get sick and die, we're not responsible.
Wow.
Yeah. They made the news. It was like a whole thing. Yeah.
I mean, I would want to see pretty rigorous testing for current cases as well as antibodies before I would give it like a clean bill of health. But, you know, I mean, at some point, life does have to go on, too.
All right. So
as long as patients separated from each other.
Got it. And I'm a student, and I'm like, do I wear like a mask? Like, what would you tell us? I mean, if they're like, it's between their livelihood and their health, right? Like they can't practice and try to get a job without taking this test.
Right.
But they're also, and particularly, you know, people with medical conditions and other things. Like if you have to sit in a room and you don't have control of your environment, what would you suggest in terms of protective gear so that they feel like they're doing the best they can to stay healthy?
You know, will they let you take gloves and masks?
I think they're going to require them to wear masks is what I'm hearing. So, but
they're not worried you're going to have a cheat sheet on the inside of a glove or
anything like that. And you have to be a pretty great cheat sheet. That's a lot. You know, it's a lot of information. It's all I'm saying. Like you can put like 3 cheats. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I would if I was doing that. I would, you know, wear disposable gloves and wear a mask. And, you know, if, like, I don't wear contacts, right? But if I did wear contacts, I probably wouldn't. I would probably wear glasses to
protection,
not have me move my eyes.
Yeah.
You know, because that's one of the things that has always kind of bothered me about the idea of masks is they're not protecting our mucous membranes.
Right.
And a lot of us, you know, cough into our hands, sneeze into our hands, touch things, touch our kids, other kids, and then rub your eyes.
Right. The eyes.
You know, so
right.
I think, I would probably really, really impress on people that you want to be careful about touching your face during this test. It might be difficult because you're going to be taking a stressful test.
A stressful test. All right, so a mask, probably not an N95 because they're very difficult to come by, and even if we do have them, we're not going to fit them properly. So a mask.
And you might be thinking where those resources from healthcare providers.
Yes.
It still is a sort of sparse economy.
Right.
Yeah.
Gloves, glasses, goggles. Should they be wearing goggles? Like, I have them like suited up in hazmat suits as they take this test.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point you get, you know, diminishing returns on being overly protective, especially if it might take you out of your game.
Yeah, right.
You know, that's something that you've got to think about. Like, is it worth risking sitting in a room full of people and then not performing well because you're so stressed out?
Right.
I mean, you know, people have to be honest with themselves and with what they're willing to put up with to just figure out what they will and won't do.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to ultimately come down to an individual choice.
Agree. That makes sense to me. Don, do you have any other questions?
Not really any other questions. I think we touched on a lot. I do have one comment though. I actually took an 8-hour test on May 14th in a center with other people.
And how was that?
Yeah, I took step 1 and it was a horrible test, but not fun. 8-hour testing is never a good time. But I wore a tie mask that goes around the back too. But I realized after about 4 hours, you just get it's almost like you're just breathing in your own air and you get kind of like lightheaded with it a little bit. Yeah. So I kind of like loosened the bottom just a little bit for my sake, but definitely at the expense of, protection in my health. And I'd done the N95 thing actually at the drive-through testing sites when they were up. I was working at those and we'd have an N95 on for about 6 hours in like the 90-degree heat. And so I knew there's no way I could have done that and taken.
Really interesting.
Interesting
experience. Huh. Clever. Strange. All right. Well, we completely adore you, and we think your time is amazing. You letting your family out of the house? Like, how are your... you know a lot of things. So I know there's a lot of people who are not leaving their house, are afraid to go back outside. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that before we end.
We go outside and we see very few people, but we still have a select group of people that, we do socialize with.
Yeah.
Just because it's ridiculously unhealthy to keep a 7-year-old cloistered.
Right. 7.
Yeah. But we do a lot of bike riding on the levee and a lot of playing in the park and, try to stay out of crowds, but it seems like everybody is willing to do that.
Yeah, right we get it. I think New Orleans gets it more than most cities for a variety of reasons, and would be good so far. So we'll see how it continues. But I just thank you for your time. I'm really psyched about this, and I know our listeners are going to be super, super excited to hear from you. And I know your time is super valuable, so I appreciate it. Anything else that you want to add? Any intellectual property issues that arrived? I'm an intellectual property professor, so that's what we usually add. We ask at the end, but we don't usually have no.
I would like some, but I don't have any.
Yeah.
I do think that it's really important to note that if we're requiring people to wear masks all the time, that can really be scary in some situations. So like if you go to the gym, you're supposed to wear a mask. If you have underlying cardio conditions or respiratory conditions, when that mask gets soaked with sweat, it's very hard to breathe through. So that could cause problems. In the building that I work in is a 24-floor building. We have rules in place to keep people apart that says we can have 2 people in an elevator at one time. So a lot of people are going to be taking the stairs. If you're wearing a mask and impairing your breathing and you're not in good shape or you have underlying health conditions, what happens if you get dizzy and fall down the stairs? Those are environmental hazards that I anticipate that are part of controlling a different one. So I think we need to be aware that that's one of the real common things in both industrial health and environmental health is you solve one problem and you cause 5 more. So we should be cognizant of that we go forward.
That's really good to know. It's really interesting.
Yeah. That's what I'm not worried about.
Yeah.
People falling down the stairs.
Falling down the stairs, not recognizing. Yeah. Right.
And they've got something over there.
Right. So if you start to see people wobbling, you need to go help them. Right. Exactly. Right. Now we need to be trained in what happens when people pass out.
More education, more public health intervention.
More challenges.
More emails.
You're amazing, and I would never have talked to you if we hadn't had this situation. So I'm glad our paths crossed. I think it's really interesting, and I'm really excited about the Little League. So that makes my day. I'm so psyched that it's back up and running, and Little League is on. So yes, it's so great.
Major League will be
awesome.
That's cool.
That's super important. Well, I imagine it's been a challenge with a 7-year-old, and it's nice to have fun things happening again. So, awesome. Cool.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again. Are you cool with us posting this? Do you need to review it before we post, or are you okay with it? That's the legal.
No, I'm okay.
That's my legal hat. Yeah. I just have to make sure you say yes. Yeah.
And then talking about the panel.
Yeah. Well, let's turn this off real quick and just say stay on, but let's end the official thing so we can post that. And again, thank you so much for coming. And just hold on just 1 second. So you've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. And I'm Elizabeth Townsend Gard. If you like this podcast, keep listening. Also, we have a Facebook group. Come join us. We talk about a lot of things. We also have an Instagram account. And of course, most importantly, I really hope you get a chance to quilt today.